All right, so today we're diving deep into what happened to Alexei Navalny, trying to get a clearer picture of all that.
Mm.
The source you gave us this time is a YouTube video transcript.
Yeah.
It's from TV Rain, that independent Russian media outlet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and the title's pretty intense, right? The Assassination of Navalny, how Putin planned to eliminate his main enemy. So we're going to, stick to what this source is telling us.
Yeah.
So you can really get a good understanding of how everything went down.
Yeah, TV Rand, they've got a reputation for some pretty hard-hitting investigative journalism, so I'm really interested to see what they've found.
Right. Like the title itself is kind of a throws down the gauntlet.
Yes.
So the source kicks off by setting this scene. There was a lot of dissent against Putin brewing in the years leading up to 2020. There were protests like everywhere. Ingushetia,
Yeah.
Yekaterinburg. And then there's this really fascinating case of Ivan Golunov, the journalist who was framed on drug charges.
Yeah.
And the source really makes the case that, that really sparks some public outrage and kind of helped to galvanize the opposition.
It is really interesting how the source connects these events that seem kind of separate at first glance. Like they're suggesting that each time there's some dissent that pops up outside of Moscow, the Kremlin, responds super swiftly and decisively. It's almost like a pattern, a strategy to keep control.
Yeah, it's like they're saying that Putin sees any opposition outside of Moscow as like a direct threat.
Yeah.
To his power.
Yeah.
And this is where Navalny comes into the picture. I know you're familiar with his work, but the source really digs into his rising popularity and how his smart voting campaign was really starting to, gain some traction.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask about that. I'm really interested in these nonviolent resistance movements.
Yeah.
And the smart voting, that's a great example, right? Because instead of just calling for boycotts, which can be really ineffective, Navalny's strategy was to kind of use the system against itself.
Right.
So by encouraging voters to support any candidate, anyone who had a chance at beating Putin's party, they were able to pull off some wins that nobody really expected.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. So he's building this movement, he's challenging things, and the source draws a parallel with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, another political figure who Putin targeted.
Oh, yeah.
It's like the Kremlin has this playbook, right? Like for dealing with anyone who gets a little too big for their britches, especially if they start gaining influence outside of Moscow.
It definitely makes you wonder how the Kremlin, like how they view these threats and how they react. But then in 2020, everything changes. With the poisoning?
We all know the basics, right? The in-flight illness, the emergency landing, that fight to get him to Germany. But this source really focuses on all those conflicting stories that came out in the beginning. Like the Russian authorities were pushing this idea of a simple medical emergency, but then you have these independent labs finding Novichok.
Right. And Novichok, that's not something you just find lying around. That's military grade. So that really points to state involvement, right? The Kremlin.
Absolutely. And the source goes deep into the investigation by Bellingcat and the Insider. They trace the FSB agents involved, connected them to this chemical weapons facility in Shikhani. It's really detailed. They built a really strong case.
Amazing how they pulled that off.
And then you have Navalny, taking things into his own hands with that phone call to Konstantin Kudryavtsev, one of the agents involved.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I know you love a good spy story. This is where things get really interesting. So Navalny pretends to be this high-ranking official.
Yeah.
And he basically tricks Kudryavtsev into spilling the beans about the whole operation.
Wow, what a story.
Right.
It's a brilliant example of investigative journalism and activism all in one. And that phone call, it totally blew apart any attempt by the Kremlin to deny they were involved. And this leads to the source's main argument, which is
that Putin was behind the whole thing.
Exactly. They argue that, given how the FSB is structured, and just how audacious this whole thing was, there's no way it happened without Putin knowing about it and approving it.
But didn't Putin deny it all during his press conference? I vaguely remember something about that.
Yeah, he did. But the source, they analyze every word, highlighting how evasive he was, how he never actually denied it outright. They argue that his words, or lack of them, really speak volumes about how culpable he is.
Okay, so they're building this pretty strong case against Putin. It's like a puzzle, and they're putting all the pieces together. But what happens next? Navalny survives the poisoning, and then he makes this crazy decision to go back to Russia.
Right. And, you're interested in how people navigate these authoritarian regimes. This is where things get really complicated. So the source kind of paints this picture of Navalny's return as a deliberate choice. fight or surrender. He knew what the risks were. He knew what was probably going to happen. But he chose to face it head on.
Yeah, I remember thinking at the time that it was, I mean, it was so brave,
Mm.
but maybe a little reckless too. The source doesn't really talk about that angle, does it?
That's interesting you say that. The source presents it more as like this necessary act of defiance, like a refusal to be silenced or intimidated. But yeah, I think it's a valid point. Like, what are the consequences of a decision like that for Navalny himself, but also for the whole opposition movement?
Right, right. So he goes back, and of course they're waiting for him. The source talks about how they diverted his flight to avoid those crowds of supporters. And then they just arrested him immediately.
And that arrest, the source argues, that's like the start of this whole new phase in Putin's crackdown. Like, it shifted from targeting specific people to just dismantling anything and everything, any potential source of opposition.
So it's like Putin realized he couldn't just silence Navalny. He had to silence anyone who might follow him.
Exactly. And the source talks about how they used the pandemic restrictions. They called it the sanitary case to suppress protests and restrict freedoms even more.
Oh, wow, that's right. We were talking before about technology and authoritarianism. It's like the pandemic gave the Kremlin all these new tools
Totally.
for controlling information and limiting how people gather.
Absolutely. And the source argues that they use those tools really effectively. They even point to the closure of Memorial International, which was a super well-respected human rights organization. They were documenting all the repression from the Soviet era. It's a scary example of how quickly they can silence even the most established groups.
Wow, yeah, that's chilling. And they're saying all of this was leading up to the invasion of Ukraine.
Right. By crushing dissent and creating this atmosphere of fear and isolation, Putin basically paved the way for war. He made sure there wouldn't be any real resistance at home to his aggressive foreign policy.
It's a terrifying thought. But it makes a lot of sense. The source even brings up Hannah Arendt's idea of the banality of evil to explain how people in the system just become complicit.
Yeah, it's that whole idea that people get so used to just following orders, so scared of what'll happen if they speak up, that they just lose sight of the morality of what they're doing.
It's a dark thought. Like good people can be drawn into a system of evil.
It really makes you think.
So where does that leave Navalny and his legacy? He's in prison, facing tougher and tougher conditions. But the source says he's still like this powerful symbol of resistance.
Right, and they highlight those lyrics from Oxymiron's song, We Can't Be Caught. It really captures that spirit of defiance, like a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's still hope.
Yeah, that's powerful. And it's not just about Navalny himself. The source talks about his team, too. They're still doing investigations, exposing corruption, even though they're constantly being harassed and threatened.
It's amazing how resilient they are. It shows how powerful the truth is, and how important it is to hold people in power accountable.
But realistically, how much of an impact can they really have when the system is designed to silence them?
That's the big question, right? The source admits that the opposition in Russia faces huge challenges. They talk about how civil society's been dismantled, the media has been suppressed, information online is controlled.
It's like they're saying dissent just can't survive in that kind of environment.
Exactly. But even with all that, the source still suggests there's some hope. They point to the success of smart voting as proof that even in a rigged system, there are ways to resist.
But they also say that that approach has its limits. As long as the Kremlin has the power, real democratic change just isn't possible. So what's the answer?
That's the question that keeps coming up in this whole deep dive. The source doesn't give us any easy solutions, but they do suggest a few things that could be done.
Like what?
Well, they talk about international pressure. Things like sanctions, diplomatic isolation, supporting human rights groups. All of that can weaken the regime and maybe create some space for democratic reforms.
So it's about making it harder for the Kremlin to keep doing what they're doing.
Exactly. And they also highlight how important independent media is and online platforms for getting information out there and countering the regime's propaganda.
Yeah, we've seen what social media can do
Right.
for mobilizing protests and exposing corruption.
Yeah.
It's a way to get around censorship
Yeah.
and reach a wider audience.
It's definitely a double-edged sword, though. The same tools can be used to spread misinformation. But the source argues that overall, the benefits outweigh the risks.
So they're calling for continued support for independent media, citizen journalism, any platform that can amplify the voices of dissent.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that this fight for freedom, it's a long one, it's hard. There are going to be setbacks, there will be disappointments.
But it's a fight worth having. Because the alternative is just too grim to think about.
I agree.
A world where authoritarianism wins,
Yeah.
where dissent is silenced, where the truth is hidden.
Yeah, the source ends on a really powerful message of hope. They say that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can survive. And even when the odds seem impossible, the fight for freedom can go on.
It reminds us that we all have a role to play, whether it's speaking out, supporting those who are risking everything for freedom, or just refusing to let hope die out.
I couldn't have said it better myself. I think this deep dive has been really insightful, helping us understand just how complicated things are in Russia and the challenges that lie ahead.
It's given us a lot to think about, but I think it's important to end on a positive note.
Yeah, for sure.
Because as long as there are people willing to fight for what they believe in, as long as there are voices of dissent challenging the status quo, there's always reason to hope for a better future.
Yeah, it feels like such a delicate balance right now. On the one hand, you have this incredibly brave guy and his team refusing to be silenced. But on the other, you have this regime so powerful that seems determined to crush any opposition.
It really is like David and Goliath.
Yeah.
And the stakes are so high. The source reminds us that fighting for freedom, it's rarely easy. It's a long game. It takes incredible courage, resilience, and the ability to adapt,
So given everything we've talked about, what do you think happens next? The source doesn't really make any predictions, but it does leave us with this question about the future of Russia and the fight for democracy there. It does, and knowing how much you like thinking about political trends, this is where things get really fascinating. The source lays out a couple of possible scenarios, each with its own challenges and opportunities. One possibility is that the regime, they just managed to completely shut down dissent and hold on to power forever. That's like the worst case scenario, right? Where fear and repression become normal and any hope of democracy is gone.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. I mean, they're already pretty far down that path. But the source also says there's always a chance for something unexpected to happen, something to shake things up, like a sudden economic crisis, a military defeat, or even just a shift in how people feel.
Exactly. History is full of examples of regimes that seemed untouchable, and then they just collapse because of their own internal problems. The source reminds us that even the most oppressive systems have weaknesses, and they can be overthrown when people find the courage to fight back.
So what can we do? What can people listening to this do to support the fight for freedom in Russia? And really anywhere else facing these kinds of challenges, it can feel so overwhelming sometimes, like anything we do is just a tiny drop in the ocean.
I get that feeling. It's easy to feel powerless when you're up against injustice on such a massive scale, but the source actually gives us some practical things we can do.
Like what?
Well, they talk about staying informed and seeking out different viewpoints. It's really important to challenge our own biases, to question the stories we're being told, and to look for information from lots of different sources, especially ones that are critical of the regime.
So it's about being critical of the information we consume,
Yeah.
not just passively taking in whatever's thrown at us.
Exactly. And then there's the question of what concrete actions we can take. The source says we should support those independent media outlets and human rights organizations that are working inside Russia. Even small donations can make a big difference in helping them to keep doing their work.
Right, that makes sense. What about things like contacting our elected officials, or raising awareness on social media, or even going to protests? Do those things really make a difference?
They absolutely can. It's easy to think of those things as just symbolic gestures, but they show those in power that people are watching, that we care about what's happening, and that we're not just going to stand by and let injustice happen.
So even though it feels like an uphill battle, our voices do matter.
They do. And the source leaves us with this thought. The fight for freedom is something we have to do together. It needs people to take action, to speak up, to support those on the front lines, and to never give up hope.
That's a powerful message to end on. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. It's shown us just how fragile democracy is, and how hard it is for those who resist authoritarianism.
It has, but it's also been really inspiring, seeing the courage and resilience of the human spirit, and remembering that even when things are darkest, the fight for freedom can go on, and it must go on.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.